The old house was quiet, the way only a house holding its breath can be. Outside, the city of Baltimore hummed its ceaseless, weary lullaby, but inside, there was only the soft tick of a wall clock and the sound of Elias's own breathing. It was late, long after his daughter Amara had drifted off to sleep, her small chest rising and falling in the gentle rhythm of dreams. He was in the spare room, a space that had become a repository for things he couldn't bring himself to throw away. Boxes of old clothes, college textbooks, and a small sealed container labeled simply, Lena, his late wife. 3 years. It felt like a lifetime and no time at all. He hadn't opened the box since the day her mother had tearfully given it to him. But tonight, a strange, quiet compulsion had led him here. With gentle fingers, he sliced the tape. Inside, nestled amongst worn paperbacks and a collection of sea glass, was her old phone. A relic from a different age. A slim silver rectangle that felt impossibly small in his calloused hands. He didn't know why, but he took it to his workshop, a small corner of the living room where he repaired the city's broken electronics. He found a forgotten charger, its cord stiff with age, and plugged it in. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the screen flickered to life. A photo of him and Lena on their wedding day filled the screen, her smile so radiant it seemed to warm the cool night air. A lump formed in his throat. He navigated the old interface, his fingers clumsy. He found a folder labeled Notes to Self. It was mostly grocery lists and reminders, but at the bottom was a single audio file, dated just a week before the accident. His heart hammered against his ribs. He'd never seen this. He pressed play. Lena's voice filled the silent room, warm and clear, as if she were standing right beside him. It wasn't a note to herself. It was a note to him. "Hey, my love," she began, a soft smile in her voice. "Silly, I know, recording this, but I was just thinking about how much you give. You give everything, Elias. You pour yourself into me, into this life we're building, and you never ask for a single thing in return. And I was thinking, if something ever happened to me..." Her voice hitched for a fraction of a second. "If I wasn't here, I need you to promise me something. I need you to let someone pour back into you. Don't close the door, my love. Don't build a fortress so high no one can ever get in. Your heart is too big to keep it all to yourself. Find someone who sees the light in you, the way I do. Find someone who deserves the quiet strength you carry, and let them love you. Let them love our baby. Promise me you'll let the light in again." The recording ended. There was only the sound of her soft breath, and then silence. Elias sat down hard on the small stool at his workbench. The sound was sharp in the stillness. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and buried his face in his hands. He didn't sob. The grief was too old, too settled for that. Instead, a single hot tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. She had known. Somehow, she had known he would build a fortress. She had known he would lock the gates and stand guard, with their daughter as his only reason for living. For 3 years, that fortress had been his home, his sanctuary, his prison. The voice note wasn't a memory. It was a key he never knew he needed, to a door he'd forgotten was even there. And in that moment of breaking, as he sat alone in the quiet dark, he was unknowingly being made whole again. His life, and the quiet fortress he had built around it, was about to be turned upside down. The next morning began as all mornings did, with the gentle glow of dawn filtering through the blinds. Elias was already up, the scent of coffee a warm, familiar presence in their small, clean apartment. He moved with a quiet economy of motion, a man who had long ago learned to navigate the tight spaces of his life with grace. He was a tall black man in his early 30s, with a strength in his shoulders that came from work, not a gym, and a weariness in his eyes that came from loss. His hands, which could coax life back into the most stubborn of machines, were gentle as he pushed open his daughter's bedroom door. Amara was a small, vibrant sun in the center of her bed. Her natural hair, which he'd painstakingly twisted the night before, formed a beautiful halo around her head, the colorful beads at the ends resting on her pillow. He sat on the edge of her bed and brushed a stray twist from her forehead. "Time to wake up, little bird," he whispered. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and bright and full of a wisdom that sometimes startled him. "Is it pancake morning, Daddy?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. He chuckled, a low, warm sound. "It's Tuesday. Tuesday is oatmeal morning." She made a small grumble of protest but sat up, her beaded braids clicking softly. Her energy was the engine of their small world. She spoke in long, breathless sentences, her thoughts tumbling over one another in a rush to get out. While he made oatmeal, she sat at the small kitchen table, her crayons scratching furiously against a piece of paper, providing a running commentary on her dreams, the color of the sky, and the profound injustice of Oatmeal Tuesdays. The walls of their kitchen were a gallery of her work, vibrant, chaotic drawings of smiling suns, lopsided houses, and stick figures. In every drawing there were two figures, always holding hands, a tall man with brown skin and a little girl with a cloud of beautiful coils around her head. Elias worked as a freelance electronics repairman, a master of reviving vintage audio equipment and forgotten technology. His shop was a small rented space in a historically black neighborhood, crammed with schematics, soldering irons, and the ghosts of old machines. He was known for his patience and his honesty, qualities that kept him busy but never made him rich. He wore his work clothes, pressed but worn jeans and a faded polo shirt, with a kind of quiet dignity. Everything he did, every circuit board he mended, every bill he paid, was for the little girl who sat humming at his kitchen table. She was his world, the only world he allowed himself to fully inhabit. He would sometimes catch his reflection in a dark screen and see the fortress Lena had spoken of. It was there in the set of his jaw, the careful distance in his eyes. He was kind to everyone, but he let no one in. After he dropped Amara at school, the quiet of his truck would descend, and he would sometimes touch the photo of Lena clipped to his visor. He was keeping his promise to be a good father, but the other promise, the one from the voice note, felt like a language he no longer spoke. Across town, in a world that felt like a different planet, Naomi Clark commanded a boardroom. She was a CEO, a titan of the tech industry, a black woman who had shattered so many ceilings she'd lost count. Her power was a palpable thing, an invisible armor she wore as impeccably as her tailored suit. Her natural hair was swept into an elegant updo, not a single strand out of place. Her deep brown skin was luminous, even under the sterile, fluorescent lights of the 37th floor. She moved through her life with a precision that left no room for error, or for warmth. Her voice was calm and measured as she dismantled a subordinate's flawed proposal. "Your projections are based on sentiment, not data," she said, her words cutting through the air like chilled steel. "Bring me data." The man withered under her gaze. She felt a familiar, hollow ache. They didn't respect her. They feared her. And fear was a lonely currency. That evening, she stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse apartment. The city sprawled below her, a glittering tapestry of a million lives she would never touch. Her home was a masterpiece of minimalist design, all glass and marble and cold, empty spaces. It had been featured in magazines. It felt like a museum. There were no crayon drawings on her refrigerator. There was no clutter on her counters. There was only silence, a silence so profound it seemed to have its own weight. Naomi had achieved everything her parents had demanded of her, everything she had demanded of herself. She was a success story, a symbol. But symbols, she was learning, were terribly lonely things. Her last relationship had ended when her fiancé, a man from a similarly powerful family, had admitted he was in love with her portfolio, not her person. "It's a merger, Naomi," he'd said, as if that explained everything. "It makes sense." She had never been loved without conditions, never been seen for the woman who existed beneath the title and the tailored suits. She had 1,000 contacts in her phone, but not a single person she could call to simply watch the city lights with. The fortress she lived in was made of glass and steel, but it was a fortress all the same. She sighed, her breath fogging a small patch of the window, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt the sharp, unwelcome sting of tears. She had everything, and she had nothing at all. The storm broke that night with a sudden, biblical fury. Rain lashed against the windows of Naomi's office as she worked late, trying to outrun the loneliness that nipped at her heels. It was nearly 9 when she finally packed her briefcase, the wind howling a mournful song against the glass tower. The drive home was treacherous, sheets of water making the road slick and treacherous. She was on a quieter back road, a shortcut she rarely took, when it happened. The engine of her luxury sedan sputtered, coughed, and died. The lights flickered out, plunging her into an almost absolute darkness, punctuated only by the rhythmic sweep of the useless windshield wipers. She tried the ignition again. Nothing. Her phone, she discovered with a surge of panic, was at 2% battery. There was no one to call anyway. She was stranded, alone, in a designer suit and 4-inch heels, utterly helpless. It was a feeling she loathed more than anything. For 20 minutes, she sat in the dark, the rain drumming a frantic beat on the roof, each passing minute stripping away another layer of her carefully constructed composure. She was about to give in to a wave of despair when a pair of headlights cut through the deluge, slowing as they approached. An old, slightly beaten-up pickup truck pulled over. A man got out, pulling the hood of his jacket over his head. He was tall, his silhouette a dark, solid shape against the storm. He approached her window cautiously, and she cracked it open an inch. It was Elias, on his way home from an emergency repair job across town. He didn't see a CEO. He didn't see one of the most powerful women in the city. He saw a person in trouble, her face pale and strained in the dim light of her dying phone. "Everything all right, ma'am?" he asked, his voice calm and steady over the roar of the rain. "My car, it just died," she said, her own voice sounding small and foreign to her ears. "Pop the hood for me. Let me take a look." She did, and he spent a few minutes under the hood, illuminated by the flashlight on his phone. The rain soaked through his jacket. Finally, he came back to her window, shaking his head. "Looks like your alternator gave out. You're not going anywhere in this tonight." Her heart sank. Can you call a tow truck?" "Service is spotty out here in a storm," he said, his gaze kind. "And you could be waiting for hours. Look, my name is Elias. I'm on my way home just a few miles from here. I can give you a ride. You can call for a tow from there." Naomi's entire life had been a lesson in trusting no one. A stranger in a pickup truck on a dark road was a collection of red flags. But then she looked at his face again. There was no angle, no calculation in his eyes, only a simple, quiet decency. And she was out of options. She nodded. "Okay, thank you." He held the door of his truck open for her, a gesture so simple and courteous it felt like it belonged to another era. She slid in, her silk blouse feeling absurdly out of place against the worn fabric of the seat. The truck was old but impeccably clean, and it smelled, faintly, of cinnamon and something warm and sweet, like apple juice. It was the smell of a life lived, a domestic scent that was so alien to her own world, it was almost shocking. He didn't press her with conversation, he just drove, his large, capable hands steady on the wheel. The quiet in the cab wasn't empty like the silence in her penthouse. It was a comfortable, peaceful quiet. For the first time all night, she felt her shoulders begin to relax. He was just a man. A kind man who had stopped to help. It was that simple. And that, she realized, was the most complicated thing she had experienced in years. The next day, a lavish gift basket arrived at Elias's small repair shop. It was filled with imported cheeses, expensive wines, and a small, crisp envelope containing a thank you card and a check for an amount that made his eyes widen. It was from Naomi Clark. He hadn't recognized her name until his first customer of the day, a talkative woman named Mrs. Gable, had pointed to the delivery van. "Oh, that's Clark Industries. My son says the CEO is one tough lady, a real powerhouse." Elias looked at the basket. It felt transactional, a payment for a service rendered. It was the way her world worked, he supposed, but it wasn't his. He found the number for her executive assistant on the card and called. He was polite but firm. He asked the assistant to have the basket picked up. "But Ms. Clark insisted," the assistant began. "Please just tell her I was glad she got home safe," Elias interrupted gently. "No payment is necessary." He hung up and went back to his work, but the gesture lingered in his mind. Later that day, a courier returned for the basket. Tucked inside was a simple, handwritten note from him on a piece of company letterhead. It said only, "You're welcome." In her office on the 37th floor, Naomi held the note. The handwriting was neat, the letters strong and clear. "You're welcome." Not, "Thank you for the extravagant gift." Not an attempt to leverage the situation. Just two simple words. It was an act of quiet dignity that disarmed her completely. No one had ever turned down something she offered. It intrigued her. It made her think of the smell of cinnamon in his truck, the calm in his eyes. A week later, she found her excuse. Her grandmother's vintage turntable, a cherished object that held one of the few warm memories from her childhood, had been silent for years. She'd had a half-dozen technicians look at it, all of whom had declared it a lost cause. On a whim, she had her assistant research specialist in vintage audio repair. Elias's name was at the top of the list, lauded in online forums for his near-magical ability to revive lost causes. She called him herself. Her voice was clipped and professional, the CEO voice she used for all transactions. "Mr. Vance, this is Naomi Clark. I'm told you're the best. I have a piece of equipment that needs repair." There was a brief pause on the other end. "The lady with the car," he said, not a question but a statement. "Yes, I can take a look." He came to her penthouse that Saturday. He had his daughter with him. His usual sitter had canceled at the last minute. Amara stood slightly behind her father's leg, her eyes wide as she took in the vast white space. She clutched a stuffed bunny in one hand and a small box of crayons in the other. Her braids, today with bright yellow beads, bounced as she peeked out at Naomi. "I hope this is okay," Elias said, his expression apologetic. "I can reschedule." "No, it's fine," Naomi said, feeling an unfamiliar awkwardness settle over her. She didn't know how to talk to children. They were unpredictable, illogical. While Elias knelt before the silent turntable, his dark hands moving with a surgeon's precision, Amara explored the living room. She tiptoed across the marble floor, her small sneakers squeaking softly. She ran a hand over the cool leather of the sofa. Finally, she came to stand before Naomi. "Your house is very quiet," Amara stated, as if delivering a final verdict. Naomi managed a small smile. "Yes, it is." "Do you have any paper?" the little girl asked. "I want to draw the windows. They look like big TVs." Naomi, flustered, found a stack of premium heavy-stock printer paper. Amara settled on the floor, humming to herself as she drew. Naomi found herself watching the child instead of the man working on her prized possession. She watched the absolute focus in Amara's eyes, the way her small tongue poked out from the corner of her mouth in concentration. There was a simple, unburdened joy in the girl's presence that felt like a foreign element in the sterile air of the apartment. After a while, Amara got up and walked over to Naomi, holding out a finished piece of paper. "This is for you," she announced. Naomi took it. On the page were 3 stick figures drawn in bold, cheerful colors. One was very tall, with short black scribbles for hair. One was small, with a cloud of braids and yellow beads. The third figure stood beside them, wearing a wobbly but recognizable dress. All 3 figures had brown skin, colored in with a deep, rich crayon. All 3 were holding hands. "That's Daddy," Amara explained, pointing. "And that's me, in my yellow dress. And that's you." She pointed to the third figure. "Because you have pretty hair." Naomi stared at the drawing. Her throat felt tight. No one had given her a gift that wasn't an investment or an obligation in over a decade. And this little girl, this stranger's child, had drawn her into their family. She had colored her skin with the same brown crayon she used for herself and her father. She had seen her, not as a CEO, not as a symbol, but as a person with pretty hair who belonged in the picture. Naomi had to blink back sudden, sharp tears. "Thank you, Amara," she whispered, her voice thick. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Elias fixed the turntable. After an hour of patient, focused work, the soft, warm crackle of vinyl filled the room for the first time in 20 years, followed by the rich, soulful voice of Etta James. The sound was so full of memory and warmth that Naomi felt another crack appear in her armor. She offered to pay him, pulling out a corporate card. "Name your price," she said. He shook his head, wiping his hands on a rag. He quoted her his standard hourly rate, a number so modest it was almost comical in this setting. "That's the price," he said, his gaze steady. He wasn't playing a game. He was just a man who believed in fair work for a fair price. In the weeks that followed, other things in the penthouse mysteriously broke. A lamp began to flicker. Her laptop refused to connect to the printer. Naomi kept finding reasons, however flimsy, for him to return. And he kept coming. Sometimes Amara was with him. The little girl was the bridge between their two worlds. She would leave drawings scattered around the apartment, small bursts of color in the monochrome landscape of Naomi's life. She taught Naomi how to play Go Fish on the marble floor and insisted on telling her long, rambling bedtime stories before she and her father left. One evening, Elias was working later than expected, trying to fix a complex wiring issue with her home theater system. Amara, growing restless, declared that she was hungry. "I want pancakes for dinner," she announced. Naomi, completely flustered, reached for her phone to order from the most expensive restaurant in the city. "No," Amara said, with the unimpeachable logic of a child. "I want homemade pancakes, like Daddy makes." Naomi looked at Elias, who gave her a helpless shrug. "I don't have anything here," she said. "No flour, no eggs." An hour later, after a trip to a nearby gourmet market, they were standing in Naomi's state-of-the-art kitchen, a space more accustomed to caterers than to actual cooking. Naomi, in a silk blouse, stared blankly at a bag of flour. She had never made pancakes in her life. The scene descended into a light, warm comedy of errors. She put too much baking soda in the batter. The first pancake was burnt on one side and raw on the other. Amara's blunt honesty provided a running commentary. "That one looks sad, Naomi." Elias, trying not to laugh, showed her how to flip them properly. Flour dusted her cheek. A bit of batter landed in her elegant hair. And then, something remarkable happened. Naomi laughed. It wasn't the controlled, polite laugh she used in boardrooms. It was a real, deep, genuine laugh. A sound of pure, unself-conscious joy. The sound surprised even her. In the middle of her perfect, sterile kitchen, covered in flour and surrounded by imperfect, slightly burnt pancakes, she felt happier than she had in years. Later that night, with Amara asleep on the plush sofa, a half-eaten pancake still on her plate, they sat in the quiet living room, the city lights twinkling below. The conversation, for the first time, drifted away from broken electronics. He told her about Lena. He spoke of her smile, her fierce love, her unwavering belief in him. And then he told her about the voice note. "She told me to let the light in again," he said, his voice low and soft. He looked at Naomi, his gaze direct and open. "I've kept the door locked for a long time." The confession hung in the air, a profound and vulnerable offering. And Naomi, feeling a sense of trust she hadn't felt since she was a child, offered a piece of her own story in return. She told him about the pressure to be perfect, about the crushing loneliness of the top, about her ex-fiancé who had seen her as a good investment. "I've been in boardrooms that decide the fate of thousands of people," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I've negotiated billion-dollar deals. But I have no idea how to make a pancake. No one ever thought it was important to teach me." She looked around the vast, beautiful room. "I built all of this to prove I was worthy, and I've never felt more worthless than when I'm sitting in it alone." He didn't offer advice or pity. He just listened. He saw the woman beneath the CEO, the lonely heart inside the glass tower. When she finished, he simply reached over and gently wiped the smudge of flour from her cheek. His touch was warm and steady, a simple human connection. In the quiet that followed, a new and fragile understanding began to grow between them, as delicate and as beautiful as a garden planted in the most unlikely of places. The world Naomi inhabited, however, was not a garden. It was a jungle, and there were always predators watching from the shadows. His name was Marcus Sterling, a longtime board member who had coveted the CEO position for years. He viewed Naomi's rise with a bitter, simmering resentment. He saw her confidence as arrogance, her power as an affront. He began to notice a change in her, a softness around her eyes, a distraction in meetings. She was leaving the office at a reasonable hour. She seemed happy, and Sterling knew that happiness was a weakness he could exploit. He hired a private investigator. It didn't take long to find Elias. The investigator delivered a file full of photographs. Naomi, laughing in a kitchen with a man in a work shirt and his young daughter. The man leaving her penthouse late at night, carrying the sleeping child in his arms. The images were innocent, domestic, tender. But Sterling knew how to twist them. In the cold, cynical light of the corporate world, they could be made to look like anything he wanted. A scandalous affair, a lapse in judgment, a security risk. He called an emergency board meeting. The subject? Ms. Clark's questionable conduct and its potential impact on shareholder confidence. The boardroom was a theater of hushed whispers and tense, sideways glances. Naomi walked in, sensing the ambush immediately. Sterling stood at the head of the long, polished table, a smug, predatory gleam in his eyes. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Naomi," he began, his voice dripping with false concern. "It has come to the board's attention that you have formed a personal relationship that demonstrates a profound lack of discretion." He gestured to the large screen at the end of the room. An image flashed into view. Elias carrying a sleeping Amara out of Naomi's building, the timestamp reading 11:47 p.m. It was the night of the pancakes. Another photo showed Naomi and Elias on her balcony, talking, the city lights behind them. The photos were grainy, invasive, and stripped of all their innocent context. "This man, Elias Vance," Sterling continued, his voice rising, "is a repairman, a common laborer with unrestricted access to your home, your personal devices, and by extension, sensitive company information. You have been consorting with him, alone, with his child, at all hours. This is, at best, a catastrophic lapse in judgment. At worst, it's a security breach that puts this entire company at risk. It suggests an emotional instability that is unbecoming of a CEO." The board members shifted uncomfortably. They were men and women of a world that understood power and money, not tenderness. They saw what Sterling wanted them to see, a powerful woman brought low by a foolish, unprofessional dalliance. They looked at Naomi, expecting her to be defensive, to deny, to promise to sever all ties with this man. They expected her to do whatever it took to save her career. Naomi stood silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the photograph of Elias and his sleeping daughter. She saw the gentle way he held her, the protective curve of his arm. She remembered the feeling of laughing in her kitchen, covered in flour. She remembered the quiet dignity of a man who returned an expensive gift basket, and the profound kindness of a little girl who drew her into her family with a brown crayon. Sterling saw a liability, a scandal, a mistake. Naomi saw the first real, unconditional happiness she had ever known. When she finally spoke, her voice was not defensive. It was calm, clear, and imbued with a strength they had never heard before. It was not the strength of a CEO. It was the strength of a woman who finally knew her own worth. "You are right about one thing, Marcus," she began, turning her gaze from the screen to him. "I have formed a personal relationship. But you are wrong about what it demonstrates." She walked slowly to the head of the table. "For years, I have lived by the metrics of this company. We measure value in stock points, in market share, in quarterly growth. We worship at the altar of data. I have dedicated my life to those metrics, and in the process, I lost the ability to measure the value of anything else." She looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each board member. That man you call a common laborer taught me more about value in 2 months than I've learned in 20 years of business. He taught me the value of integrity, of doing a good job for a fair price. He taught me the value of kindness, of stopping for a stranger in a storm. And his daughter? Her voice softened. That little girl taught me the value of belonging. She gave me a gift, a simple crayon drawing that is worth more to me than every stock option this company has ever offered. She looked back at the photo on the screen. You see a security risk? I see a man who works with his hands and loves his daughter with his whole heart. You see a lapse in judgment. I see the best judgment I have ever made. You see an emotional instability. I see, for the first time, a life. She turned back to Sterling, her expression unreadable. This world of yours, this world of glass towers and transactional relationships, it's a fortress, and it's cold inside. I've been cold for a very long time. She slid her resignation letter across the polished table. I choose warmth. I choose pancakes. I choose a life where my worth isn't determined by a stock ticker. My resignation is effective immediately. She turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind a stunned, absolute silence. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound of a chapter ending and a life beginning. Naomi didn't go to her penthouse. She didn't call her lawyer or her publicist. She got in a taxi and gave the driver the address to Elias's small apartment building, a place she had never been but knew by heart. The rain had started again, a gentle, cleansing drizzle this time. When she stepped out of the cab, the armor was gone. The tailored suit felt like a costume from another life. She was just Naomi. She walked up the 3 flights of stairs, her heart beating a steady, hopeful rhythm. She knocked on the door. Elias opened it, his face a mixture of surprise and concern. He took in her appearance, the expensive suit, the exhaustion in her eyes, the raw vulnerability she was no longer trying to hide. He didn't ask what was wrong, he just opened the door wider. "Come in," he said softly. She stepped inside. The apartment was small, but it was filled with a warmth that her penthouse had always lacked. Amara's drawings were taped to the walls. The air smelled of ginger tea. It smelled like a home. "I quit," she said, the words coming out in a rush of air. "I walked away from all of it." The tears she had been holding back for years finally came. Not tears of sadness, but of profound, terrifying relief. Elias didn't rush to comfort her with empty words. He just stood there, a quiet, steady presence, letting her feel the weight of her own freedom. He led her to the worn, comfortable sofa and went to the kitchen. He came back with a steaming mug of ginger tea, pressing it into her trembling hands. "Stay here," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a gentle command, a promise. A small noise came from the hallway, and Amara appeared, rubbing her eyes, her stuffed bunny clutched in her hand. She saw Naomi sitting on the couch, her face streaked with tears. She walked over and looked up at her with serious, perceptive eyes. She had seen her father cry like that, in quiet moments when he thought she was asleep. Amara looked from Naomi to her father and back again. Then she asked the question that hung in the air, the question that held the weight of all their pasts and all their possible futures. "Does that mean you're staying forever?" Naomi looked up, her tear-filled eyes meeting Elias's. He was watching her, his expression full of a deep, unwavering tenderness. He was waiting for her answer. The world outside, with its boardrooms and stock prices, had faded away. There was only this room, this man, this child, and the simple, devastating question. She thought of the cold, empty penthouse and the life she had just left behind. And she thought of the warmth of this small room, the taste of burnt pancakes, and the feeling of being truly, completely seen. She smiled through her tears, a real, radiant smile. "I'd like that very much," she whispered. 6 months later, the late afternoon sun spilled through the windows of a small house with a wide front porch. The air was filled with the scent of freshly turned earth and the sound of a child's laughter. Naomi, wearing jeans and an old t-shirt, knelt in a new garden, her hands covered in soil. The CEO was gone, replaced by a woman who was learning the names of flowers and the simple joy of watching something grow. She hadn't started a new company. Instead, she had used her resources to create a foundation, a nonprofit that provided grants and mentorship to small, community-focused businesses. Places like Elias's repair shop, which was now expanding, training young technicians from the neighborhood. She had found the new way to measure value, not in profit, but in people. Elias came out onto the porch carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. He watched her for a moment, a quiet contentment on his face. The fortress around his heart was gone, dismantled brick by the patient love of this incredible woman and the wisdom of his own child. The voice on the old recording had told him to let the light in, and he had. The light was here, kneeling in his garden, a smudge of dirt on her nose. Amara ran up to them, her braids bouncing. She was holding a new drawing. "I made a forever picture," she announced, holding it up for them to see. It was the 3 of them again, a tall man with brown skin, a smiling woman with beautiful natural hair, and a little girl in the middle, her hands held by them both. They were standing in front of a small house with a garden, under a big, brilliant yellow sun. At the bottom, in Amara's wobbly handwriting, were their names: Elias, Naomi, Amara. Naomi took the drawing, her heart full. She looked at Elias, her eyes shining. No words were needed. They had built this small, beautiful, improbable family. As the sun began to set, casting long golden rays across the yard, the narrator's voice seemed to whisper on the evening breeze. Love, it seemed to say, is not found in the grand halls of power or the cold calculus of success, but in the quiet, sunlit spaces where you are finally seen for who you truly are. Family is not a matter of blood, but a choice, a promise remade every day in small acts of kindness, in a shared imperfect pancake, a steady hand in the dark, and a child's drawing that shows the world not as it is, but as it ought to be. Elias reached for Naomi's hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. Together, their hands enveloped Amara's, a perfect, unbreakable circle of belonging, right there in the fading light of a brand new day.